Welcome to In Conversation with Darrell Bricker. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm glad to be back in conversation with Darrell for another episode of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the big developments and trends in Canadian politics. In today's episode, we'll aim to cover three topics. First, Canadians' complicated views about trade in the context of Donald Trump's tariff threats. Second, whether there's a constituency for more spending on defense and security. And third, if time permits, how Canadians are thinking about Canada Post's ongoing labor strike and the recent spike in labor actions more generally. Darrell, thanks as always for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me on, Sean. I really appreciate it.
You said something interesting last week about trade that I want to take up in the context of this ongoing debate about tariffs and all the rest. Darrell, you said that notwithstanding the conventional notion that Canadians are predisposed to trade or that free trade is a settled issue in our politics, it's actually the subject of skepticism within the Canadian population. Why don't you elaborate on what the polling tells us? Are Canadians hardcore free traders, or is that just a story we tell ourselves?
I think it's a story we tell ourselves. I mean, the appeal of more open free trade is a relatively recent phenomenon in Canadian history. Those of us who have been around for a while remember the free trade election of 1988,
Yes.
in which that was the principal topic up for consideration, and two different visions of Canada's future were presented. Probably the last time we've had an election that was that substantively driven, and
Yes.
the free trade won out. But once we got past that election, we moved into the NAFTA phase of things and immediately went into a huge recession. And NAFTA was like the worst thing that you could talk about in Canada at that time, and something that really stuck to the Mulroney government. And honestly was probably one of the major reasons they were defeated, not just the constitutional meanderings and also what they did on the GST, but the fact that we were in a recession, and a lot of people attributed it to NAFTA. Chrétien comes in, and continues on the process with liberalizing trade, and the Canadian economy booms over a period of time. So, in a more recent iteration, I say, of Canada, we've become more free traders, but it's always been very controversial, and I should say is becoming more controversial again, because what we've seen in a global context is that while Canadians may be more interested in free trade than some other countries, the whole concept is going through a bit of a disruption in terms of global public opinion. We saw this in a survey that we released for the Halifax International Security Forum last week, in which support for global free trade is down by 10 points on a
Wow.
global basis.
I was speaking to someone else recently who said that self-identified conservatives are less market-oriented than one might think these days. So let me put that to you, Darrell. What about conservatives in free trade? How much do they converge or diverge from this growing skepticism that we're talking about?
Well, one wonders what a conservative actually is these days. Is it just somebody who's interested in voting for the Conservative Party in the next election campaign, or is it somebody who has a well-developed, comprehensive sense of what their political values are? I'd say it's probably at the moment it tends to be more people who are identifying with change than it is anything that's a well-developed, coherent view of what their conservative philosophy is. But let's just focus on the conservative philosophical proposition. We've seen the whole conservative movement going through some really big changes, and
Yes.
Canadians are not immune to that. Some of it is driven by economic policies and their view of the size of government and what government should be doing in the world. Some of it is driven by things like religious values. Some of it's driven by philosophical positions that are coming from different places in the world. So I don't think it's a particularly coherent view. But one element I would say is not as valued as we used to see in the past was this idea of a free trade relationship or free trading, just as it's become somewhat in dispute, I would say, in the United States and among conservatives in other parts of the world too,
Yes.
other than that more kind of traditional old neocon kind of approach that's more associated with Ronald Reagan or with Margaret Thatcher, that period of time in the through the 80s. Other than with that group, the ascendant element of, I would say, conservatism in the world today is kind of nationalist and in some ways more protectionist. So free trade is seen as something that aligns with global elites, and these conservatives don't necessarily see themselves as being aligned with global elites.
There's been some talk, as you no doubt know, Darrell, about whether our ongoing bilateral issues with the United States could lead to Canada finding itself in a position where it needs to impose tariffs on other countries. What we're seeing play out in the US is that some politicians and perhaps the population more broadly are seemingly indifferent to or reject altogether the notion that tariffs would result in economic costs. Do you have a sense about Canadians? If they're indeed free trade skeptics, do they really believe that you can impose tariffs and other forms of protectionism without costs? Or is the idea that the costs are outweighed by the benefits of more domestic jobs and production?
Well, unless you work in the lumber industry or maybe a very specific industry in Canada, tariff is a fairly foreign word. It's not
Mm,
something that's been deliberated or discussed at a national basis. It hasn't been a top of mind concern since the late 1980s and early 1990s, when we were going through that last political debate over free trade with the United States and then ultimately with NAFTA. So I think that this is a topic that is going to be it's going to be newly introduced to the public, and they're not going to necessarily be as interested in the concept of tariffs as they are going to be interested in the effects of tariffs,
yes.
particularly on their own personal situation. So if it has an effect on their cost of living, that will be a problem, but it won't be specifically tariffs. It'll be cost of living as it's driven by tariffs. If it has an effect on their access to certain goods that they're used to getting, obviously it'll have an effect on how they view tariffs. If it has an effect on their job, they'll probably have a view of tariffs. But at the moment, none of that's happening. So all we have at this point is somebody bringing up a concept that Canadians haven't had to deal with for a long time, that being Donald Trump saying that there's going to be a 25% tariff. What that means in your day-to-day life and your day-to-day decision making, the public isn't well acquainted with it. But if it actually does happen, they will become, as any economist or anybody who watches this closely will say, they will become acquainted with it in a very personal way very quickly.
Last question before we turn to defense and security issues. Talk a bit about this nascent free trade skepticism within the Canadian public and the extent to which it may be activated as a political issue. I asked that question in a context in which the so-called political settlement on immigration, of course, is unwinding before our eyes. Is there a world where we resume a public debate or a political debate about free trade in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, there could very well be that. I mean, to the extent that there is a debate on free trade that's taken place among the Canadian population over the last while, it is the place of China in free
Yes.
trade. And so the threat that it might represent to jobs in this country, and also to the extent that it affects security issues in this country, and how China's been acting in the world and how that might affect Canada and Canadians. Uh, Free trade with the United States has not been on the radar at all. And so, as I said before, it's maybe everything old is becoming new again, and we're about to go through this. And as you can remember, it became the number one issue in the country and actually decided the fate of a government. So, are we going to go back to there? Well, we've done it once before. Let's see again. And by the way, not the first time in Canadian politics. John A. Macdonald and the national policy, going all the way
Yes.
back to the founding of the country. So, trade, and particularly our relationship with the United States, is instrumental to everything about Canada, and particularly in terms of our economic prosperity. So there's no doubt that if this becomes a controversial problem or a difficult problem between Canada and the United States, it will quickly become a problem in public opinion.
Yeah, well said. I want to take up your points about China and security in a way, because ostensibly a major part of the demand from Trump is that Canada does more on defense and national security. And I would say, Darrell, having spent some time in Canadian politics, my sense is that a big part of the problem here is that Canadians are generally unmoved by calls for more spending in these areas. To use the old adage, if Canadians have to choose between guns and butter, they overwhelmingly choose butter. Am I wrong? What does the polling tell us, particularly in terms of the comparative choices about allocating scarce resources to defense and security compared to, say, childcare, dental care, and so on?
Yeah, you're hitting on absolutely the right point. So the dumb question that pollsters, including me, sometimes ask is, do you think we should spend more money on defense? Or do you think spending on defense is important? And of course, Canadians will say yes. But the real question is trade-offs.
Yes.
And what are legitimate trade-offs, and what is the competitive set for defense spending. And the it's interesting that defense is supposed to be strong, but when it comes to the competitive process of going through priorities for the public, it tends to be really weak. Now the question is around that, if a different emphasis or priority can be put on it because of, for example, our relationship to the United States, or because Canadians are feeling a legitimate level of threat as a result of international competition, particularly militaristic type of competition. And with Canadians, it's interesting. It tends to be more aligned with our North. For some
Interesting.
reason, well, it's part of our cultural predisposition that we have a significant role to play in the North. But if you're talking about childcare versus defense spending, childcare wins every time. If you talk about healthcare versus defense spending, healthcare wins every time. But I don't know if we'll have that luxury going forward if Donald Trump decides to make that a priority for Canada. And the idea that you could extend this to 2032 and you have some kind of undefined plan to get there, while maybe very well intentioned and the people who proposed it can see it, it's not necessarily what we think. It's what the people who are evaluating it think. And I think it's difficult to make that look credible.
Well, in that vein, we have a lot of politicians and policymakers who listen to the podcast. What lines of arguments or case can they make to Canadians that in a world of scarcity, we need to be dedicating more resources to defense and security? How in effect, Darrell, do they confront this inherent trade-off between guns and butter?
Well, it's like that old Steve Martin joke: how to become a millionaire and pay no taxes. First, find $1 million. I mean, it's a really really tough one. But I think the pressure that the United States could be putting on us relative to tariffs, and the effect that it could have on a lack of defense spending could have on the public themselves, the behavior of our government affecting the behavior of other governments, may be
Yes.
something that you could bring them to. But from a domestic perspective, it's really hard to do. And the reason for that is, to the extent that people see threats on the security front these days, they're not the traditional military spending threats.
Well said.
So one of the things that we saw in the Halifax International Security Forum survey was that when you ask Canadians what are the biggest threats confronting the security threats confronting Canada, number one was cyber hacking. Number two was disinformation. None of that has to do with spending more money on fighter jets or building a new fleet of ships. Natural disasters are seen as another big priority threat. The traditional way of looking at defense spending, which is conflict with other countries, Canadians don't see that as a threat in their world. And in fact, most people in the world don't. The only people who do are people who are living proximate to a conflict. So if you live in Israel, defense spending is a priority. If you live in Turkey, defense spending is potentially a priority. If you live in Taiwan, defense spending is a priority. If you live in Poland or Finland or Sweden, defense spending is more of a priority. If you live in Canada, it's like, not really. I don't see what the Russian threat is. I don't quite
Yes.
understand it. I don't see what the Chinese threat is, at least from a militaristic perspective, maybe from an economic perspective, but from a military perspective, other things keep me up at night. That one doesn't really. And I'm speaking on behalf of Canadians as they represent themselves in surveys rather
Of
than
course.
myself.
At the risk of sounding naive, my sense is, at least historically, Canadians have been proud of the contribution that they've made to global peace and security. One thinks of, during my childhood, the representation of Canada as a peacekeeper and all the rest. Is there any resonance with a line of argument focused on Canada as a good global citizen, or does that fall short, particularly in a world in which Canadians are really concerned about the microeconomy and their household budgets?
This is the Laurentian elite version of military.
Yes.
That we're equipped with very good loud whistles and very visible striped shirts, and we're the good guys that punch above our weight in the world.
Yes. Yes.
Unfortunately, we're just about the only people who think that, particularly among our our NATO colleagues, and particularly our biggest trading partner and military partner. So yeah, I don't think that that's going to cut it. I mean, think back yourself, Sean. I mean, when you were younger, that's what we used to always hear when we were in university. This
Yes.
is our place in the world. It was about kind of the Pierre Trudeau version of things, or the
Yes.
Brian Mulroney version of things, which were both Laurentian elite versions of how we should participate in the world. We're the good guys. Now, the interesting thing that you see in the survey that we did for the Halifax International Security Forum. So let me ask you this: guess which country is the number one when it's seen as making a positive contribution in the world over the next decade? Tell me what you think it is, Sean.
That's a tough question. I'm going to say the United States.
Canada.
Interesting.
The
Interesting.
United States actually ranks below NATO.
Wow.
It's in the mid tier of the pack. At the bottom of the list, who's at the bottom of the list this year of all the countries and organizations we asked about?
China.
No, Iran.
Okay.
And it's interesting to look at the results from the survey, because we've been doing it for over a dozen years for the Halifax International Security Forum, and you can see the global public, and there is such a thing as the global public now that you can measure,
Yes.
that it does respond to what's happening in the news. So back in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected as president of the United States, by the time we did the 2017 survey, the US bled off 18 points in terms of people's responses to that question,
Wow.
and never came back until Joe Biden became president. When Ukraine was attacked by Russia, Russia bled off double digits, has not come back. When
Sure.
COVID happened back in 2020, China bled off double digits in terms of international reputation, hasn't come back. Which country do you think is taking a downturn this year?
I don't know.
Come on, you got to try harder than that, Sean.
Well, I can't guess. You'll have to tell me in the
Israel.
audience.
Israel.
Interesting. Interesting.
And that's one of those issues where people have very, very strong views in Canada about the Israeli Gaza question, except
Yes.
most Canadians.
Yes.
Most Canadians have very divided opinions on this question.
I see.
They can kind of see both sides, but the people who are on the extremes think that everybody's behind them, and the truth is it's not true.
Before we get to our final topic of the Canada Post strike and how Canadians are thinking about labor actions more generally, I have to take you up on your comment earlier about China. One of the major issues that has played out in Canadian politics over the past 12 or 24 months is this notion of foreign interference in our democracy. It seems pretty self-evident that we're going to have to make some major investments in fortifying our borders, but also fortifying our public square. Is there a public appetite, Darrell, for those types of public expenditures?
100%. And the reason for it is because it is perceived as a direct and personal threat.
Hmm.
So the way I described it when I was at the forum, to people who would bother to listen to me, was the two things at the top of the list in Canada are disinformation and cyber attacks. One
Yes.
of them is people fooling around with your mind. The other one is people directly fooling around with your stuff.
Yes.
And we also feel that our governments are least prepared to deal with those threats. In fact, we're over prepared to deal with things like traditional military threats, or appropriately prepared for dealing with
Yes.
traditional military threats like conflicts among nations. But those two things, on a global basis, most people don't think that their governments are prepared to deal with them, and they're the ones they feel the most keenly. So if you're going to make an argument for defense spending, and maybe this goes back to the question that I asked before, don't ask about ships, don't ask about planes, don't ask about new tanks. Ask about things that are going to improve our cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's a good takeaway, as I say, particularly for those policymakers who are listening to our conversation and thinking of entry points to persuade Canadians that we do need to make these types of investments, focusing on protecting our borders and protecting our democracy may be the best line of argument. And before we go, though, I'd
So
be remiss if
but
I
I got a
didn't.
question for you. I got a question
Please,
for you, Sean.
please.
So I read a really good piece in the Hub this week. In fact, my co-author and occasional co-author John Ibbotson recommended that I read it, and that's the piece that you and Rudyard wrote on Donald Trump and his tariffs. And you made a really good point, which was this isn't a negotiating position. This is what he wants, and it's because it's not about negotiating. It's actually about access to the cash that the U.S. government would get as a result of doing this. So one of the things that we know that the Trump administration is coming at us about, I mean, two of them are the ones that he said. And there's a third one that when I was in Halifax, I heard from the stage repeatedly. First time in the
Interesting.
dozen or so years that I've heard it from the stage, which is Canada being a slacker on its defense spending. So if Canada decided that it was going to really emphasize doing something about developing some global capabilities and global standards and dealing with cyber attacks and disinformation, how do you think the Trump administration would respond to that? Is that an appropriate defense response?
I think there's something to that. I think there is a sense, Darrell, that Canada has become a bit of a taker in the Five Eyes relationship, that for all intents and purposes, it's really three or four eyes, and the others are essentially drawing on the collective resources of the group, not contributing to them. And so I think in that sense, it may be a strategic area where Canada can start to make progress towards a 2% target, but in a way, as you've set out today, that is responsive to how Canadians think about these issues, and where maybe we can make a contribution that speaks to a specific issue. Like I I think a bit about the what we've learned through the foreign interference hearings. We'll have a final report, I guess, sometime in the next year. And I don't want to sound naive, but I've been struck by how susceptible our political system is to political interference, particularly from China. If that's not a wake-up call, at least to policymakers, if not the broader Canadian public, I don't know what is. Uh,
But
but as I said,
do you think it'll be something that the Trump administration will say, hey, good on you, you're listening to us, you're finally making a contribution?
I think that's possible. I think the Trump administration, particularly some of the people who've been nominated, have in their minds a new way to think about the West's relationship with China. I think, for instance, if someone like Elbridge Colby, who incidentally we've had on our podcast before, and who as early as this morning, December 4th, is now being speculated about as a possible replacement for Pete Hegseth, the defense nominee who's going through a bit of a rough ride. Colby has talked about the extent to which Canada, the U.S., and others need to reorient their defense and security policies to recognize the threat represented by China. So that's a long way of saying, Darrell, I do think there is some opportunity here to square the circle between our ongoing negotiations or conversations with the incoming Trump administration. And I think what you've set out today, which is really valuable, how Canadians themselves think about these issues. Let me get though to Canada Post before we wrap up, because I also want to hear your thoughts about how Canadians are thinking about the strike, which now is in its third week. How is it influencing how they think about Canada Post, or even the ongoing role of crown corporations themselves?
Well, I think there's that, which is I think people are probably going to find new ways not to work with Canada Post. So long term, the employees who are out on the picket line are inducing the public and the people who are their biggest users on the
Yes.
business side of the game to find another way to avoid them. And there are so many ways to avoid them now. So longer term, I think not good news for Canada Post. But the real effect of this is a political effect, and
Interesting.
how it plays into Pierre Poilievre's message that Canada is broken.
Yes.
Nothing works.
Yes.
Nothing works. We can't even get letters delivered in this country now. We can't get parcels just before, just before the holiday season, where people are waiting to send letters to Santa Claus and everything else. All of a sudden, Scrooge McDuck at Canada Post decides to go on strike. Now, I'm not making any comments about the workers. I mean, they've
Sure.
got their issues, but as an institution, uh, the relevance of Canada Post in the lives of Canadians continues, but will probably be less after this. But where the real effect is going to be is not just on the future of Canada Post, it's really going to be playing into Pierre Poilievre's
Just Bronner.
rhetoric about Canada being broken. And this would just be a great example of that. We can't even deliver a letter. You can't get your passport. You can't get your parcels delivered. You can't get whatever. I'm going to come in and I'm going to change that. Just one more example of the Trudeau government not being able to make things happen. So the government can try and keep this as away from politics, but it is inevitably going to be used for politics, and it's just one more plank actually one more stick of kindling. Actually, probably a big log for Pierre Poilievre to throw on the fire, the bonfire that is the future of the Liberal Party of Canada.
Final question. Do you have a sense of what Canadians think about unions more generally these days, Darrell? My sense is that they've experienced similar declines in public trust and confidence as other institutions. Is that right? And if so, what do you attribute it to? And what are the risks associated with the rise in labor actions that we've seen over the past 12 months or so?
So private sector unions tend to have, I would say, a better reputation than public sector unions. And to the extent that Canada is unionized, it's overwhelmingly unionized as
Yes.
the public sector unions. There is a growing belief in Canada that our public service, because Canada is broken, is not necessarily providing the level of service to Canadians that they feel that they're paying for. So union activism among public sector unions, if it continues down this path, is actually a good point of confrontation, I would say, for governments who are saying that they want to change direction and they want to get Canada back on track, or however you want to describe that, or take Canada back, or whatever it is that Polyev is saying these days. So governments that are coming in to make a change, it's probably providing them with lots of good, rich material. Every time there's a union controversy, to turn to the public and say, "See, here's what's wrong. We need to do something about this." And people who don't have the same access to all the things that you get when you're a member of the public service these days, will and people who are struggling in the private sector to just get by are going to be looking at that and saying, yeah, I think that's got to change. So if it's private sector unions, it's one thing. It's the company and the union going at it. But if it's the taxpayer they're going at, I don't think that they're going to get a lot of sympathy from taxpayers.
What a tour de force today, Darrell, from trade to defense, security, China, and now labor strikes and trade unions. I want to thank you for joining me, and I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
Thanks a lot, Sean.